Got the green light. That's off. So
It's off when it's ready.
Okay, off.
Yes, and on when it's green.
On when it's green. Yes.
Once I've finished, I'll explain along.
Okay.
Where's the
Yeah. Right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to begin just in a minute now that we've got our panel together. It's interesting to see the regulars. They're the ones that stand at the bar for the longest. So, good evening, everyone. My name is Robbie Mochrie. I'm a volunteer here at the library, and I've had the pleasant duty of organising this week's sessions. This is the fifth and last. We've already had Smith on inequality, wealth, capitalism, power, and tonight Smith on education. The way that we did this is quite simple. We took a concept which is important in each of the books of The Wealth of Nations, and we have spent an evening trying to think about what's relevant about Smith's ideas for the present day. I'm delighted that we've got an excellent panel. You'll also be delighted, I'm sure, that you're not going to have to listen to too much of me. Instead, I'm now going to hand over to Graham Blackett of Bigger Economics and Prosper, who's going to chair this evening. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Robbie. Actually, before we dive in, another bit of housekeeping. If I could ask everyone just to check they've got their phones switched off or on silent, that would be wonderful, thank you. And also, when we come to the Q&A bit later on, I'll be looking for volunteers. So start thinking about your questions now, and I'll wander about with this microphone, and it's being recorded, so you do need to wait until I reach you with the microphone, if that's okay. So tonight, we're applying Adam Smith's 18th century economic and social critique to some of the realities of Scottish education today. And to do that, we have an excellent panel. First up, we have Lindsay Patterson, who's Professor Emeritus of Education Policy at Edinburgh University and a leading authority on the history of Scottish education. His teaching and research has included how education shapes civic values and social mobility, and his upcoming book, Lessons from Scottish Schools, Why Knowledge Matters, perfectly positions him to help us understand today's system in the context of Adam Smith's views on education. We have Hannah Garrow, who I have here as Chief Executive of the Carnegie Trust for the Universities of Scotland, but she's going to explain that's no longer what it is. Having previously served as the Scottish Government's Head of Skills Delivery and Head of Third Sector. She brings crucial on-the-ground insight into the realities of student funding, hardship, and the role philanthropy plays in education today. We have Claire McPherson, the Director of University of Scotland, which advocates for the higher education sector, and so at the sharp end of today's funding debates. Her previous experience includes a number of key roles with the Scottish Government and the Scottish Funding Council, so she's perfectly placed to help us unpack the current policy and funding landscape. We have James Miller, the Principal and Vice-Chancellor of the University of the West of Scotland and Convener of University of Scotland. He began his career as a clinical nurse, making him the first nurse to become a Scottish University Principal. He brings this mix of healthcare and academic experience in management and leadership to an institution that's been leading on widening access and equipping the modern workforce. So the structure of tonight, I'm going to go to each of the panel members who's going to speak for 7 minutes. If it looks like they're going to go for more than 7 minutes, I will ask them to wrap up. Then we're going to have a bit of a panel discussion, and then we're going to open it up to questions from the floor. So as I said, if you haven't already started thinking about your questions, start thinking about them now. So first up, Lindsay.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the generous introduction. Adam Smith held 3 views about education. 2 of these are very well known, but I think the third one is by far the most important. The first is the one that people are least surprised about. That went off. Yeah. Okay, sorry. Right, the first is education as human capital. In Smith's words, a man educated at the expense of much labour and time to any of those employments which require extraordinary dexterity and skill may be compared to an expensive machine. That teachers would not work hard or effectively if they are paid a salary by the state or by endowments. Only when fees are paid directly by students, he thought, do teachers have an incentive to improve. However, these views are not really about education, in fact, at all. They're about the social context of education. Smith Thank you. Thank you. Yes. Okay, right, back to his comments on the intrinsic character of education are his third set of views. Now, the starting point of this for Smith is the psychologically damaging effect of the division of labour. That damage happened because, in his words, the man whose whole life is spent in performing a few simple operations has no occasion to exert his understanding. He naturally loses, therefore, the habit of such exertion and generally becomes so as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human being to become. This, what he called torpor of mind, is what Hegel later called estrangement and what Marxists then adopted under the name of alienation. Back to Smith's words again, it renders a person not only incapable of bearing a part in any rational conversation, but of conceiving any generous, noble, or tender sentiment, and consequently incapable of forming any just judgment concerning many even of the ordinary duties of private life, and of the great and extensive interests of his country, he is altogether incapable of judging. Smith's educational response to this was based on the idea of the publicly funded parish schools that had been established across most of Scotland since the late 17th century, having been developed in the Scottish Reformation by John Knox and Andrew Melville a century before. Smith said, if in these little schools the books by which the children are taught to read were a little more instructive than they commonly are, and if instead of the smattering of Latin that was common, they were instructed in the elementary parts of geometry and mechanics, then the literary education of this rank of people would perhaps be as complete as it can be. As well as combating the torpor caused by the division of labour, universal education of this kind would also have wider social implications. It is in these respects, I think, that the long-term importance of Smith's intrinsically educational ideas is profound. Universal basic education would underpin social order because, again in Smith's words, the more the people are instructed, the less liable they are to the delusions of enthusiasm and superstition. Education would also strengthen civility because people would then be, in his words, more capable of seeing through the interested complaints of faction and sedition. And education would underpin pluralism. Smith was thinking here about religious faction, the constant fear which Enlightenment thinkers had of a return to the religiously inspired barbarity of the previous century. Where there is religious freedom, he said, multiple sects developed and are forced to get on with each other. Or in our terms, where there is toleration and pluralism of belief and expression, civilization flourishes. So according to Smith, education can create dignity and can dispel factious disorder. The reason it can do so, he thought, is found in the content of what is taught and learned, what we would call the curriculum. Education is a remedy for fanaticism if it is, in his words, the study of science and philosophy. Smith means by science here any kind of rational learning, but he also includes explicitly science in the modern sense. He said, there is scarce a common trade which does not afford some opportunities for applying to it the principles of geometry and mechanics. This would gradually exercise and improve the common people in those principles. And these principles, he said, are the necessary introduction to the most sublime as well as to the most useful sciences. At the same time as extolling science, Smith was pioneering in his enthusiasm for the new literary form, the novel, and for histories aimed at general audiences. These could give insights into human character and relationships. When reading history, which shows real people, or reading novels, which show credible characters, he said, we enter into their misfortunes, grieve when they grieve, rejoice when they rejoice, and in a word feel for them as if we ourselves were in the same condition. This, of course, is the impartial spectator developed through stories, seeing ourselves as others see us, in Robert Burns' eloquent encapsulation of Smith's most important ethical principle. These ideas about science and about the imagination represented a revolution in liberal education. Hitherto, at least since the Renaissance, it had been about languages, about metaphysics and moral philosophy, and about civic responsibility, and the closest it came to science was abstract mathematics. During the 18th century, however, liberal education was in the process of being modernised. In Scotland, that took place through what was called the Academy movement, the founding of new schools called academies that had a widened curriculum to cater for the new commercial and industrial age. And incidentally, that's why about a third of all secondary schools in Scotland are still called academies. They date from that time. Smith's ideas were part of this educational revolution. Throughout Britain, more widely, it developed further in the 19th century when T.H. Huxley pioneered the school teaching of science, and when Matthew Arnold did the same for imaginative literature. Thereafter, right through the 20th century, what Arnold called the best that has been thought and said would be included in the school curriculum, the ideas that Smith advocated. That was gradually extended socially as well, far beyond what Smith envisaged, to women, to all social classes, to all religious and ethnic groups. But that extension does not contradict anything that Smith wrote. This then, I think, is the greatest educational revolution that Smith envisaged. And so we can sum up his words. We can sum up his aim, which idealistically he envisaged for education. What we admire in the liberally educated person, he said, is acute and delicate discernment. It is the comprehensive accuracy of the experienced mathematician. It is the great leader in science and taste. That educated accomplishment is what, he said, excites our admiration and seems to deserve our applause. And upon this educational foundation is grounded the greater part of the praise which is bestowed upon what are called the intellectual virtues.
Thank you very much. Many things there I'm sure we'll pick up on the Q&A session. And as soon as we switch the microphones, we're... Okay, hang on.
How's that? Oh my gosh, what was that? Okay.
looks like we're down to one microphone.
I'm going to sort of sit up beside me and hope it doesn't go off. Right.
Okay, thank you, Hannah.
Okay, thank you. I'm really pleased to be here today to join this conversation. Like the Wealth of Nations, the organisation I work for is celebrating a significant anniversary this year. So we've just turned 125. And last week we marked it with a new strategy and a new operating name. So we were the Carnegie Trust for the Universities of Scotland, and we're now Carnegie Education Fund. And in preparing for that strategy, it meant we spent a lot of time sort of thinking about the moment that Carnegie kind of introduced the trust. At the start of the 20th century, when Scotland's universities were struggling with falling enrolments and infrastructure that was outdated, kind of changing and shifting kind of demographics and expectations, and access to higher education was kind of deeply unequal. And Carnegie's gift of $10 million, which was enormous at the time, so around sort of 200 times the combined annual budget of the 4 universities, was the kind of catalyst that allowed the sector to adapt and to modernise. And it's hard not to see parallels with today. So the kind of nature and scale of the challenges are different, but the pressures feel quite familiar. So financial strain, shifting expectations, ageing infrastructure, persistent inequalities. And so as we've been thinking about our future direction, we've kind of asked ourselves, what might catalyse reform today, and what role might an organisation like ours play? Sadly, we don't have the sort of sums of money that we did in those days. And very quickly that took us to a more kind of basic question about what does success in higher education actually look like today, and who gets to kind of shape that definition. And for Carnegie, whose kind of wealth carried a responsibility to sort of expand opportunity, education wasn't just a route to sort of personal kind of advancement or attainment, it was a way of enabling people to sort of develop their abilities and contribute to a wider kind of societal progress and cohesion. And in that sense, he was drawing on a much older tradition, which brings me very tentatively to Adam Smith. And my background, I should say, is in architectural history. So my knowledge of the Scottish Enlightenment is more neoclassical than neoliberal. I might be okay with a wealth of ornate plasterwork, but not so much with the wealth of nations. But what I did in sort of preparing for today was to see that even in his kind of economic thinking, Smith saw education as having a kind of important civic role. And he was worried about increasingly specialised forms of labour, narrowing intellectual lives and limiting people's ability to participate in society. And education could help to counteract that by developing people's capabilities and by sustaining more informed and kind of engaged citizenry. And so in different ways, both men saw education as kind of part of a civic infrastructure of a healthy society. And you can kind of see that that idea or tradition still underpins some of Scotland's kind of core policies and policy commitments today. So free tuition rests on this idea that higher education is a sort of shared kind of national asset, and fair access is about reflecting a concern for equity and opportunity and outcome. And yet when we look at the kind of current landscape and some of the pressures that face the system and the way we talk about success and sustainability, it sort of increasingly feels as though we've got kind of uncertain about its purposes. And it's not that we've kind of consciously moved away from this idea of higher education as a public good, but we no longer seem to have a kind of clear interpretation or articulation of what that means in practice. And part of the difficulty, I think, is that different parts of the system are sort of working with different definitions of public good. So you've got kind of economic growth and social mobility and civic capability and cultural life, and all those things are invoked, but they're kind of often simultaneously invoked and without a sort of shared sense of priority or balance. And when everything's a priority, nothing really is, which makes it much harder to kind of steer a system in any kind of confidence, and especially in a situation where money's quite tight. And I think when the purpose becomes less clear, that kind of public narrative also becomes a bit more muddled and unconvincing. And I think we see that reflected in public attitudes and kind of conversations about value. And our own survey work, which we did last year with Ipsos, which is on kind of public perceptions of higher education, showed that kind of only 54% of 18 to 24-year-olds think it's worthwhile to go to university nowadays, and 49% of people only thought it was useful if you went and got an actual, kind of it was a route to an actual career. And when people sort of explained why they thought the university was worthwhile, they focused strongly on kind of instrumental outcomes. So it was about that kind of training for a specific career or about improving the chances of higher pay. And much less did they talk about education as helping people to think and to judge and to kind of participate in society. And so those kind of broader kind of civic purposes, they haven't disappeared, but the kind of perceptions of value seem to have narrowed, and they're more instrumental maybe than the policy framework itself. And when we don't kind of have that kind of shared understanding or clear understanding of what higher education is for, then it's harder to make decisions about how the system should develop, what infrastructure it needs, how it should be funded. And so much of the current debate sort of focuses on the shape of the existing system. So that kind of financial health of existing institutions, the configuration of provision, the sort of mechanics of funding, rather than a more fundamental question about what is the system actually meant to deliver. And without that kind of shared purpose, even sort of well-intentioned reforms might add up to basically a rearranging of that infrastructure without actually enhancing or strengthening the value that that kind of system exists to create. And that's, I think, where we kind of find ourselves now. So there's no shortage of kind of opinions and ideas about what should happen next, but there is a far less clarity about kind of whose voices should shape those decisions. And we thought that was a place where actually we could add some value, because for all the discussion about higher education policy and the language of public good, the public voice has actually been surprisingly absent from conversations. And so building on the polling that we did with Ipsos last year, we convened a citizens' jury, which is a kind of structured deliberative process, bringing together a kind of group of members of the public to discuss their priorities for higher education and their kind of purpose and value and what they expect from it. And And the aim wasn't to sort of design solutions, it was to kind of spark debate and to listen. And we're going to be publishing the results of that in the coming weeks, so I'm not going to give too many spoilers. But what we did here was that people still see higher education as a kind of shared civic project, but they really struggle to reconcile that with the instrumental outcomes that they feel are kind of slipping away. And I think it's that kind of thing, you know, when basic sort of needs or day-to-day pressures aren't kind of met, then that broader civic purpose feels kind of harder to hold in view. And people were wanting kind of more clarity about what it's for and what it serves and how decisions are made. And I think that takes us back to the concerns that Smith and Carnegie were kind of grappling with around the role that education plays in enabling people to think and to act and to participate well in society. And it feels like that is really important right now because democratic well-being feels increasingly fragile. And actually surveys show a really worrying decline in terms of, especially in young people's confidence in democratic institutions. And so if education is more than a sector, and it's a kind of part of a civic infrastructure that allows society to think and to judge and to act together, then that kind of structural challenge isn't really a kind of financial one, it's a conceptual one. And so what we need to decide is what higher education actually wants to be in the 21st century and what capacities it needs to kind of cultivate and what public good we expect it to serve and how we can ensure equity and who gets to benefit from it. And I think until we answer those questions, the system's going to continue to sort of drift, and not because anybody lacks a kind of commitment or ambition or, you know, good intention, but because we haven't really agreed that kind of purpose that's going to anchor it. And without that, the kind of structural changes are sort of still going to be out of reach.
Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you.
Claire, have you got your microphone on?
Yeah, I'm just checking the mic's stable. Evening, everyone. I've been the Director of University of Scotland for 2 years now, and as part of that role, I'm often asked to sit on panels like this and take part in discussions like this. And sometimes in those conversations, I'm asked what I would describe as gotcha questions, like, do we have too many universities? Do too many people go to university? And do we have a problem with Mickey Mouse degrees, which is a favourite journalistic question. And they are designed to be difficult questions to answer. How many universities is too many in 2026? And on what measure and based on what evidence, and how exactly would one define a Mickey Mouse degree? But beneath those questions, I think, sits something much more legitimate, and I think actually something ultimately very healthy, which is that people are really asking, are universities still relevant and do they still add value? And of course, as you might expect, given my role, my answer to that question is very clearly yes. I think it would be unsurprising for you to hear from me that I think, you know, Scotland's universities are amongst our greatest national assets. They're obviously places of learning, but they're also engines of modern economic growth, innovation and opportunity. But we also know that the environment in which we're operating in is changing rapidly and is increasingly challenging. Financial pressures are growing, the global competition for talent and for research investment is intensifying, demographic trends are shifting, and expectations from governments, from students and from society more generally continue to evolve. So it's against that backdrop that University of Scotland has brought forward the future framework for the sustainability and success of Scotland's universities. And the origins of this framework came from the sector itself, from a shared recognition that we should take the opportunity to reflect on our own future, and a chance to anchor the future of our universities very firmly in Scotland's future and in our kind of collective ambition to continue to play a central role in the country's economic and social development. The framework matters for a simple reason. It recognises that the success of Scotland's universities can't be taken for granted. If we want universities to continue delivering the economic, social and cultural benefits that they bring to the country, then we do need to take a longer term view about the conditions that allow them to thrive. And the future framework's not simply about responding to short-term pressures. In fact, if that was what it did and all it did, it would be, I think, a failure. Instead, what we're trying to do is ask a bigger question, is what kind of university system does Scotland need for the future? And we think we have some of those answers, but I think Hannah's point about the fact that we need to include lots of different voices in that discussion sits at the heart of this work. So we think we need a system that's obviously financially sustainable, but that is globally competitive and deeply connected to Scotland's social and economic ambitions, and a system that's agile, so something that's able to respond to the challenges of today, but also anticipate the challenges facing us in the future. And to answer that question properly, I think the wide conversation has to involve current, future students, employers, staff, policymakers, and, as Hannah mentioned, the wider public. Because I think too often universities are discussed purely in terms of their role within a skills system, which is something that people find very easy and tangible to grasp, as if the primary role of universities is simply to respond to economic demand. While that is, of course, in its own way important, I think the reality is that the relationship between universities and the economy is far more dynamic than that. Universities create new knowledge that drives entirely new industries, they attract international talent and investment, and they support businesses to innovate and to grow. And by doing that, they create the conditions in which ideas become enterprises and discoveries become jobs. And if we go back to that question of Mickey Mouse degrees, in 1997, it's widely regarded as a bit of a pivotal moment in the development of Dundee's now globally successful gaming industry. And in that year, two things happened. There was the production of the very famous Grand Theft Auto computer game, and Abertay University became the first university in the world to launch an undergraduate degree in computer games development. At that time, that course faced some scepticism. It might easily have been dismissed as a Mickey Mouse degree of its day, but today it is genuinely recognised as a pioneering example of universities anticipating economic change. It predated the explosive growth of the global games industry, and it really helped position Dundee at the centre of what is now a very highly regarded tech cluster. And I think that's what universities do best, looking ahead, but we now need to take the opportunity to look ahead about ourselves as a sector rather than simply anticipate economic opportunities within Scotland's economy or indeed the global economy. So in each of the areas that Scotland currently has economic strengths, whether it's life sciences, renewable energy, financial technology, data science, you can see the origins within the university sector. But the value of universities does go well beyond the economic. And last year, former UK Universities Minister David Willetts wrote, if you were a doctor, you would prescribe more higher education. Such are the kind of significant health and social and well-being benefits of higher education, not only for graduates, but also for their families and for future generations. And that idea, of course, is not new. We as a country have long understood the importance of education to economic and social progress, and obviously one of the most famous voices in that tradition is Adam Smith, in whose name we're here this evening. And writing in The Wealth of Nations, again, not by no means an expert in terms of this panel, but Smith obviously argued that education was not only valuable for individuals, but essential for the prosperity of society as a whole. And I think that insight remains just as true today as it was in the 18th century. But Smith understood something else, which was that institutions must evolve if they're to remain effective. And I think that brings us back to the challenges that we're facing today. Ensuring that Scotland's universities have the support, the stability and the strategic clarity they need to succeed in this changing world is really vital. And having developed our thinking as a sector, we were really delighted when the First Minister suggested that the Scottish Government work in partnership with the sector to do that. And on the back of that, we've secured cross-party support from across Holyrood for this framework and its development, in the spirit that all voices need to be involved in this discussion, and it's far too important to be turned into a political football. So I think the support across the political spectrum gives the framework a real opportunity to make a difference. We approach the work from the starting point of this being evidence-led, establishing a really clear shared understanding of the funding challenges, but also the opportunities, the pressures and the challenges facing the sector in Scotland over the next couple of decades, and actually asking really challenging questions of the sector itself around how it wishes to respond and how it sees itself changing in response to those things. Ultimately, what we're going to do is produce a set of funding and policy options for consideration by the next Scottish Government post-election. But this process gives us the opportunity to state take a step back from some of the immediate pressures, although they are very important, and the annual budget cycle that makes politicians and others think in very short-term horizons and think much more carefully about how the sector, how government, how industry and the public can work together to ensure we continue to have a successful sector. I think it also allows us to reaffirm something that should unite us all, that universities are not simply costs to be managed, they are investment in Scotland's future and in Scotland's people, and something that we should hold on to as much as we can. So thank you.
Thank you, Claire. We're just going to have a change of microphones again, or do you?
No, I've got one. Yeah,
you're
no.
already, James. Okay, thanks very much.
Great, thanks very much. The difficulty in coming fourth in a panel, of course, is that much of what you wanted to say has already been said. But one of the things that I thought would be useful, because I was asked to come along and really think about this from the perspective of a civic authority like the Royal Society of Edinburgh, for example, but I can't do that and not think about it from my role as a Principal and Vice-Chancellor and also as convener of Universities Scotland. So the key issue that I wanted to talk about was not just to think about universities, but to think about the education as a whole ecosystem, whether we're talking about primary, secondary, colleges and indeed universities. And the Royal Society of Edinburgh had a conference in May of last year looking at this very subject, particularly in relation to the tertiary education system in Scotland. And if you haven't had an opportunity to look at the report from that conference, I would urge you to have a look at it. But it concluded a number of interesting, which were largely observations at that time. The first of which is that the current funding model is under severe pressure. You could not miss any of that in any of the press coverage that you've seen, not just in Scotland, but across the United Kingdom as well. And there have been various studies that have quantified that pressure, whether that is a sustained reduction in public funding over at least a decade, if not longer, but also a continuing divergence between the amount of money made available to universities per student in Scotland compared to England. So broadly, English universities per student will get around £9,500 per student per year. In Scotland, the equivalent is nearer £7,000 to £7,500. So there's a big discrepancy between England and Scotland. And of course, the term free education or free higher education is a bit of a misnomer because it is not free. It is taxpayer funded, and it is always worth keeping that in mind. So what we have had over that decade is reduced public funding to higher education from the Scottish Government, and that is a political choice. Whether we, particularly when you look at it against the economic environment, there are political choices that have to be made as to where that funding goes. The funding crisis is not restricted to universities. Colleges have seen similar restrictions in their funding as well, as indeed have secondary schools. And one of the interesting facts when you begin to look at it is that the level of funding per student across these various parts of the education system varies considerably as well. Now, there are in some instances some good reasons why they vary considerably, and the levels of the SCQF, for example, that are provided in secondary schools, some are also provided in colleges, and some are also provided in universities. And so in that classic Venn diagram, there is that piece in the middle where all three parts of the education system are providing the same level, SCQF level, but done in different ways and done to for different specifications. What has also been true, particularly of universities in recent years, is that the reliance on international student income creates a risk, and it creates a number of different risks. And there has always been this issue of whether or not international students subsidise home students. And for quite some time, that would have been an argument that was refuted by consecutive governments. But in actual fact, in more recent times, that is an irrefutable argument. International students, the income that is received from international students in universities not only cross-subsidises domestic student teaching, it also cross-subsidises domestic research that is undertaken in universities as well. And that has changed considerably over that period. It would be quite wrong to think of international students only as having financial benefits to Scottish universities. They have huge benefits culturally, intellectually and socially as well. And if I think about my own institution, the opportunity for many of our students who will never get the opportunity to go and study overseas to co-create their educational experience with international students who come to the UK is absolutely invaluable. But across that same period, the living costs for students have also been a growing barrier. There is almost, again, this misperception that student debt is not a problem in Scotland because they do not pay fees either through the student loan company as they do in England. But student debt in Scotland is as big a problem in Scotland as it is in England. They're just the debt is in a different place. They're not paying for fees, but they are usually having to take on debt for living costs, for example. And again, if I use my own institution as an example of that, 50%, over 50% of our students come from SIMD 20 and SIMD 40, the most deprived areas in Scotland. And they are generally studying full-time and in some instances working full-time as well. And many of whom are also have caring responsibilities too. So 70% of our students are over the age of 21. 45% of our students are still first in their family to go to university. So quite a diverse demography of students in my institution. But the demographic changes across Scotland are also intensifying the funding pressures. We know that we have a drop-off in our young people in the population generally in the next few years. That too is going to have an implication not just for the institutional sustainability, but also around workforce skills pipelines and long-term funding models. One of the other issues with higher education in Scotland is that the funding model has largely not changed for over 20 years. It still works on the basis that the majority of students will leave school, go to university and come out 4 years later with their degrees. The opportunity now for part-time learning, the opportunity for step-on, step-off, stackable micro-credentials, for example, are all modern ways of teaching, all modern ways of learning, but the funding model that we currently have does not respond to any of those. So all of this drives the need for some kind of reform of the funding system within Scotland, and Claire's outlined the work that's ongoing between Scottish Government and Universities Scotland at the moment. And we have, as a sector, we have placed no red lines on that piece of work. There is nothing that is off the table as far as universities in Scotland are concerned. We are willing to look at whatever is required to think about a sustainable funding model for Scotland. And if that is to be purely publicly funded, then we need to find the right sustainable model to ensure that public funding is made available for the population that wishes to go to university and to achieve the Scottish Government ambitions. The inevitability of not having a higher level of funding per student is that fewer people go to university. And that might be a considered model, it's not the one that the current Scottish Government would wish us to have. So that national review of tertiary education is absolutely needed. And it's also interesting to note that there is a parallel piece of work, which you may have seen announced just today, it was either yesterday or today, within the college sector. And that's really important, because when we look at colleges and university as a single tertiary system, it doesn't do either part of the sector serve it particularly well. There is, of course, as I mentioned in that Venn diagram, the crossover, but we need to think about the specific needs of colleges, and we need to think about the specific needs of universities as well as where we see those crossovers. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. I'm going to come and ask you for questions very soon, but maybe to kick us off, if I can start by asking one. I guess you all set out there some of the challenges that the education system is facing, and some of the things that are being done to try and address those challenges. I guess I'm wondering, can Adam Smith help us with that? If it was possible for Adam Smith to be appointed as an advisor to the next Scottish Government, what do you think the first reform might be that he would recommend?
Perhaps I can start off by being controversial. I think there are jinx on microphones, that's it now. One of the most controversial issues in the economics of education is what is the relationship between education and economic growth? And there are all sorts of models. One suggestion, for example, is that actually educational investment is not the cause of growth, but rather the consequence of growth, because richer societies, democratic societies, choose to spend the surplus wealth on luxury goods like education. And that might well be a perfectly reasonable position to take. The reason it's a controversial matter, however, is that until quite recently, the models that economists used simply used the quantity of education as the predictor and the growth rate between certain points in time as the outcome. And it turns out, in fact, that quantity of education and typically the number of years that people spend in full-time education is not nearly subtle enough. So the greatest breakthrough, really in the last 10 years, by economists, mainly at Stanford and Munich universities, but now increasingly elsewhere, is to look at the quality of education. And the reason we can do that now is the growth of high-quality international comparative studies of the quality of school education. The most famous one is the PISA studies, but there are also ones on mathematics and science in primary and early secondary, and also in reading in primary. Scotland's only a member of PISA. They withdrew from the other two and may or may not join. But anyway, this is kind of slightly, Scotland's irrelevant in this because it doesn't take part in most of these studies. Now, what's remarkable is this, that if you use not just the quantity of education, but the quality as measured by the PISA studies especially, there is an enormously strong, almost certainly causal connection between education and economic growth. Now, that's not, as everybody has said to you, that's not the only purpose of education, absolutely not. But one of them has to be economic prosperity, because we can't afford the other things, the civic capacities of education, the arts and all the other wonderful things, the fundamental sciences that people do, unless we have the economy that will fund these things. So what we can see is that we can't just talk about the amount of education, the number of universities, the number of students, the number of people staying on beyond the minimum school leaving age, the number of courses provided in schools. We also have to pay attention to the quality. Now, that's global research. That's some 70 or 80 countries in the most recent research by Hanschek and Wisman that I mentioned. But of course, Scotland's not doing particularly well. The one international study that we have remained in, the PISA study, has shown a more or less continuous decline in quality. And reading, not quite so bad, but if you go back to the beginning of the century, it's almost as bad in reading as it is in mathematics and especially in science. So one key thing that Smith would say, given the things that I summarised here, is he assumed that education would be high quality. He assumed that what you would be getting in the kind of schools that were already there from the Presbyterian church settlement in Scotland and from the expansion of that for professional careers that he envisaged as well, is that it would be high quality education. And he looked around him in Glasgow University and in Edinburgh University. He contrasted that with his rather unsatisfactory experience in Oxford and said that Oxford is pretty useless for all sorts of reasons, mainly to do with the fact that the professors have no incentive to teach well because nobody charged students' fees there, but at Glasgow, the fees, he said, produced high-quality teaching and high-quality learning. So I think Smith would probably instinctively welcome the kind of research that I've just been summoning for more recent economics, that we can't just pay attention to the money that goes in, or to the number of students, or to the number of staff, or to the number of research papers that are produced. We also have to pay attention to what people are actually learning.
So I think one of the things we talked about earlier was the beneficiaries of education, and as Claire mentioned, Smith's view that it was both a societal benefit and an individual benefit. And if we think about that in a slightly more expanded way, who actually benefits now from higher education or taxpayer-funded higher education in Scotland? And of course the individual does, and of course society does, but employers do as well. So if we think of that little triumvirate, how do we get to a point where we understand how these three beneficiaries should all contribute to how the economics of education actually works? And that's something that I think we need to think about, and I suspect will come out in the future framework work that Claire has already mentioned. And of course there have been attempts around that, particularly with the employer levy that was introduced a number of years ago, which is a UK tax with a Barnett consequential that comes to Scotland. The interesting part of that is that actually at the moment nobody can actually tell us what that number actually is, which is an interesting question that's worth pursuing a bit with the Treasury. A rough estimate, and it is a rough estimate, would suggest it could be as high as £750 million a year. Now, the original intention of that fund was that it would be additional to funding that was already being provided. What's actually happened is it has substituted funding, and therefore, arguably, employers are already paying for some of the higher education in Scotland.
Claire or Hannah, any other ideas of what Smith might recommend?
In terms of advice, I suppose one of the things that, going back to the social and economic benefit, there are lots of voices that talk about the economic benefit or otherwise of higher education and make judgments on it. And I guess if Adam Smith were to walk into Bute House and advise the next First Minister, one of the things I would be keen to see is more of that rebalancing of the debate, particularly when economic growth is perhaps not as strong as I'd like it to be, or some might say stagnant. The pressure for the system to deal with the here and the now is quite overwhelming, and that dominates debates. We saw over the last month or so the Scottish Government producing a kind of consultation document on the National Performance Framework. For those of you not familiar with it, it's a kind of set of national outcomes that they would hope we all collectively strive to achieve. And I think there's nothing in there that the university sector doesn't do incredibly well. But there's often just one element of that is the real measure of our performance. And so a more rounded understanding of the contribution to place, the contribution to tackling inequalities, healthier living, global impact, and the soft power that universities helped Scotland and the UK exercise, all of that is part of our kind of core mission. But the debate tends to narrow in very much in the skills and economic space, I think, to the detriment of others.
Okay, I'm looking for some questions from the floor. One hand went up the quickest. And when you say something, the one rule is there needs to be a question mark at the end.
Hi. There is a word that I've not heard this evening, which I think would have been in the forefront of Adam Smith's mind: apprenticeships. Yes, slight allusion with colleges there, a day release, that sort of thing. But I was wondering about the panel's view on apprenticeships.
I think they are hugely important, and there are sort of three levels of apprenticeships that exist in Scotland at the moment, and I'm most familiar with graduate apprenticeships, which was part of that new model of learning delivery that I mentioned earlier, that our current funding model isn't really up to date with. But as with all things, there's not there's nothing particularly new about it. Apprenticeships, even at graduate level, have been around for quite a long time, but what they've been called has changed over that period of time. Language courses, correspondence courses, all sorts of interesting names that are used for them. So colleges tend to think about their foundation and modern apprenticeships and graduate apprenticeships, or degree apprenticeships as they are called in England, are produced or largely staged by universities. The problem that we have in Scotland is that graduate apprenticeships are directed by a relatively small number of frameworks. And if the skills that you require as an employer are not part of those frameworks, then you do not have access to the funding that might be available to provide those apprenticeships, which was what the apprenticeship levy, or the employer levy that I mentioned earlier, was intended to fund. So there are many employers who are contributing to that tax, because it is really just a tax, who are not getting anything in return for it. So they have a huge place in colleges and universities as a different form of earn while you learn, is the phrase that's often used, and they work extremely well across both organisations.
Actually, Adam Smith was very hostile to apprenticeships as they existed in his day, because he saw it as a form of protectionism by which new entrants to a particular sphere of economic activity would be frozen out by the existing dominant people within it. He also saw it as an unproductive charge on successful employers. However, he would probably have agreed with what you've just said, which is that any system of apprenticeship has to be flexible and has to respond to what employers need. So I think that probably Smith, and this obviously in response to your question, we don't know what he would say, but almost certainly he would say this, that the problem with apprenticeships that are frozen are a bit like the problem of the Oxford academics that were frozen in ancient practices by endowments and some state funding, as opposed to responding to the fees which indicated what the market would actually want. So in this case, responding to what employers actually want is something which British apprenticeship models have historically been not very good at. I think Britain's getting a bit better at that, but yes, the sheer fact that neither the Scottish Government nor the UK Treasury even knows how much money is generated by the levy that Claire and James talked about is an indication of how unseriously we take modern apprenticeships in Scotland.
Yeah, so I mean, when we did the citizen jury that I mentioned, we talked about higher education kind of in the round, and apprenticeships was something that came up a lot with. And again, I wasn't going to kind of go into much detail because we are going to release kind of papers on it. But I think particularly when there's a lot of anxiety about graduate recruitment and about kind of what the opportunities are for people, that earn as you learn model offers real potential and security to people. So increasingly, if I speak to young people, they sort of see, there's a sort of risk kind of thing of the idea of going to university, that they're sort of worried about what the end result's going to be and if it's worth their time and if it's worth the debt and things like that. And I think there's definitely value in that kind of graduate apprenticeship, degree apprenticeship model, in offering people that level of security, but also in recognising that, it's not the same system that we had previously, and a lot of people do kind of live at home and they are working anyway while they're doing their degrees. So if you're working, why not be working in something that's actually delivering that kind of the experience that directly relates to your degree? And I think particularly in kind of subjects where there is a kind of vocational or professional aspect, you see something like degree apprenticeships in like accounting or engineering, they can knock quite a few years off that kind of journey from going into university to the point where you're kind of an accredited surveyor or engineer or whatever it is. And so I think there's real potential in that. I think the challenge is that the money is not there. So again, in the same way that there's a pot of money available for higher education, university degree places, there's a pot of money available for apprenticeships, and that pot of money is not getting any bigger. And so actually when you're looking at it, you're looking at trade-offs almost. You're saying, well, if you want to increase that, you've got to decrease that. So if you want to increase graduate apprenticeships, you're probably going to decrease traditional degree places, and people find that quite a difficult conversation to have because nobody really wants to give things up.
I think not knowing how big the pots are, I think probably breaks Adam Smith's tax maxims as well.
Hello, Leslie Martin. Thank you for those contributions. It was good to hear you questioning numbers and questioning and thinking about what education's for. But my question is really around competition, because one of the things that certainly was a feature of capitalism, which we've also discussed this week, is the central part of competition in that. And one of the changes we saw, of course, was the so-called marketisation of universities. Something that Adam Smith couldn't have conceived of is, how cities compete and business. Yeah, of course you could see businesses competing, but universities competing. So the question really is, should universities continue to compete? And if so, how might they compete in the future? And if not, what do they do instead?
I mean, I'll start with that. I mean, I think in the Scottish sector, so I think there's a noticeable difference in terms of sector collaboration in Scotland versus the rest of the UK, and James could probably speak with more direct knowledge of that. Some of that is because it's one of the benefits. I'm not saying there's lots of benefits of the current funding model, but one of the benefits is institutions are given a set number of places. So actually you're not ruthlessly competing for students, in the sense that if you can market yourself and you can attract people to your university, you fill your places, you get the funding, and you're successful, you can see under very intense pressure south of the border, muscular student recruitment could easily mean that one institution could have a really direct negative financial impact on another, depending on the way they approach that. The other feature, I think, for us in terms of research is over the last couple of decades, certainly there's been a culture of research pooling and research collaboration, and actually this year Elsevier produced a study looking at Scottish research performance relative to the rest of the UK and relative to global comparators, and we are much more likely as a sector to compete, to collaborate with industry, to collaborate with international partners and collaborate with each other. So I think there's something very collaborative about the foundation of what we do. Some element of competition is useful, and it goes back to Lindsay's point about quality. I think you want to constantly strive to be the very best that you can be, and I think part of that is having competitor institutions and choice for students and for businesses in terms of who they want to engage with and collaborate. But I think there's definitely a central core of the way that the sector works at the moment that is more collaborative than competitive.
And everyone else want to take on the topic?
So I think one of the challenges is that we sort of have a very broad base of what is kind of a university now, and so actually it's that thing about sort of the different things that they do almost, so the different contributions, and I think sometimes when we talk about them with one voice, I think that makes it quite hard, and it almost sets them up to kind of compete with each other. But actually I think it would be far better if we articulated, and it comes back to that, what's this for, and which part of, if we articulated what the purpose of different institutions or different kind of types of institutions were, because then we would get rid of any sense of, or at least kind of diminish some sense of competition, or also of people kind of trying to be the same thing, and actually say, look, there's different audiences here, there's different people looking to do different things, there's different universities providing different services in different geographic areas. So if we were, and I think the same thing cuts across into colleges too, because I think there is that sense of, that kind of, when we spoke to the jurors about this, and they were asking, what's the difference? Like, what is the difference? I don't really understand what the difference is here. And then when you say, oh, well, it's kind of like, an ONS classification, or that's part of the public sector, and that one's got a kind of private thing, that's quite hard for people to understand. So I think if we were thinking about a kind of delivery infrastructure, we need different institutions that do different things, and what we need to do is articulate what are those things, and then think who's contributing to them, and then actually we would have a sector that was a bit more kind of working in the same direction.
Yeah, I think one of the strengths of the sector is its diversity, and not enough is made of that. If you think about the ancient universities, the chartered universities, and the modern universities, they all offer something slightly different and in different places, and not just to the students but to the towns and the regions and indeed nationally that they serve. But just to reiterate the point that Claire was making, there's much more collaboration than competition in Scotland amongst the universities. Of course, there is some competition there, particularly if you think about research grants that everybody's, a number of universities might be competing for. If you were to compare that to the market system that exists in England, it is very different. Not just because of where some of the public funding goes, but also because of some private providers that exist in England that don't exist in Scotland.
Fantastic! Lots of hands going up.
First of all, this I think is the best panel, as far as I'm concerned, that has been this week. I've been a big fan of Lindsay in trying to understand why the Scottish school education system has declined. You've got lots of great things to say. In terms of my own experience of education, as an employer for 40 years, I spent a lot of money training graduates who had just come out of 5 years of university education. When I retired, I became a director of a further education college, which was good, except the funding model, I think, didn't allow enough collaboration with industry, and there was a big that was missing. The other thing is, to go back to the stuff I've learnt from Lindsay, we had to organise literacy and numeracy courses at a college for 17, 18, 19-year-olds. You know, goes back to the poor school education. Lindsay had mentioned in one of the articles I read that maths now with Curriculum for Excellence doesn't teach basically the mathematical logical process that you said goes back to Euclid. And my perception is that the scientific method seems to be disappearing from a lot of university courses. The people that are coming out with more ideology than practical skills.
Do you want to frame a question from that?
Please comment.
Yes. Oh, sorry.
Thank you. It's kind of you to say that, but I mean, it's the problem at the moment actually is a lack of a frank debate about the state of Scottish education. It descends far too readily into party political mudslinging. I fear the next 2 months because I think it's going to be nothing more than that. And if we look at what's happening, and one of the things that we fail to do repeatedly in Scotland is to recognise, despite some of the things that have been said about England, and I agree with, that there are some excellent things that have been done in England over the last 20 years, and some of these things are in effect a coalition between the Labour government of the early part of the century and the Conservative coalition government of David Cameron. And the key minister here is not Michael Gove, although he led it and he provided very important leadership, but actually Nick Gibb, who was the schools minister almost continuously in the various Conservative Liberal governments. Yeah, Nick Gibb's book is absolutely remarkable. It's one of the best, it is the best book by a practising politician about the policy process that I have ever read. Nick Gibb and Robert Peel. Peel was one of his advisors in education. He's now a head teacher in a secondary school in London. Now, what's remarkable about what they did is that they paid attention to research. So these are the lessons, it seems to me, constructively. They paid attention to research about what works in education, how do children learn, or human beings learn, and what are the implications of that for how we teach and what the curriculum is like. And the reason these are important questions is that there has been a revolution in cognitive neuropsychology over the last 20 years. A lot of it has to do with the revolution in brain imaging, but also to do with a variety of other techniques. So we know far more about how human beings learn, about what the effective form of teaching is to enable them to learn than we have ever done before. And that's the kind of thing that Gibb and his colleagues paid attention to. They then incorporated that into the curriculum, into different kinds of teacher training, into increasingly, as it all bedded down, Nick Gibb explains this very well, into all sorts of conferences, including online web forums where teachers could engage with research, do their own research, and ask questions about research. Now, it is a remarkably successful project, but because it happens in England, nobody in Scotland will pay any. I was told at a meeting a few months ago by a very senior person in the civil service side of the Scottish Government Education Department, when we were talking about changes to the curriculum. And he said, and these are his words, there will be no knowledge-based English-style knowledge-based curriculum in Scotland. It was the adjective English style that made my heart sink. That's the civil service, and that is polluted by the kind of partisan rivalry that we're about to see. So I know what we have to do in this matter. And it's not going to happen unless something changes in the way we approach learning from our neighbours.
And a lot of the research was done in Scotland.
Good evening. I've made some notes so I don't ramble on. First of all, our apologies for being late, panel and host. We had a bit of a hiccup with transport, and thank you for an interesting talks from each of you. And I'd like to answer the question you posed about what Adam Smith would say, if I may, before I ask the panel a quick question. I've been at a couple of meetings this week, and I went home thinking, did I read the same book, The Wealth of the Nations, as other people in the room? I really did. And I sort of flicked through it, and I thought, Adam Smith, from beginning to end in that book, he doesn't use the modern language, but he uses traditional language of his time, is talking about emergent living systems that are self-organising, nearly all the way through the book. And the first question I'd like to ask the panel, you're all talking about changing systems, but how many have you looked at and studied how systems change? Because if you don't understand how a system changes, how the heck are you going to change it? And if we look at work like Deming, Deming said the results come from the system and not the parts. So you've all talked about changing parts, but until you map the system right back to its roots. And the other thing, we look at the people who are now talking a little bit more about systems or modern systems, say every system is born, it develops, it dies. Education or NHS or government are all in the dying phase. We need to send them off to the hospice and develop new systems out with the old, and that includes new financial systems. So has anybody on the panel studied how systems change? That's really one of my key questions. And have you looked at things? One of the schools that comes to mind is from a very old TED talk in 2014 from Ricardo Semler, the Limonar School, I think it's called. My dyslexic strikes again. And it's self-organising, totally different and out with the system. And I think we get too focused, thank you, Tim, down a narrow channel. And unless you understand how systems work, you're not going to change it. And it is a living system. It's emergence from the bottom up. And Lindsay, you talked about the parish schools that Adam Smith, so they were emergence and they were local, they were bottom up, they were civic. But now we're doing things top down. And systems can't be controlled top down. They grow too many arms and legs. So first question, have you studied systems thinking? And second question, what about schools like the Luminar School that was a famous TED talk about in 2014? I hope that's not
I just gave an example of that in England. Yeah. So I would strongly recommend Gibbon Peel's book. I think it's called Reforming Lessons. But it may not be. Anyway, Gibbon Peel, that is exactly an answer to your question. How does a system change? He starts off at the beginning. How do they came in 2010. How does a system change? And then it changes eventually and it becomes sustainable because it becomes bottom up. And I mentioned there teachers engaging with other teachers from the bottom up, not directed by the Department for Education or the teacher trade unions, not by the local authorities because they don't have a role anymore, but rather doing it for themselves. So yes, that is the best current example I can think of the study of system change in the way that you absolutely rightly say is necessary.
Can I also talk about system change?
Well, I'm happy to say, I'm not an expert in system change at all. I'm also not responsible for changing the system either, which thankfully. But I have been interested in kind of reform and public service reform and how that happens. And I absolutely agree with you. I think the way that it's approached is just not resulting in any change. And there was an excellent paper which Demos brought out, which is called The Human Handbrake, which is looking at why good ideas go to the wall in Westminster. And you can absolutely apply that within a kind of Scottish context too. Before I left government, I was involved in doing a kind of review type thing of the skills system or skills landscape. And that was fine, you know, set out a vision and everything like that. But then when it actually goes into the system for people to start to operationalise it, it's like people just cannot cope with the complexity of things, and it gets broken down into pieces and set up as groups, and then all of the vision and sort of idea goes out of it, and it becomes something really technocratic, and then everybody's saying, what on earth are we doing this for, and why were we doing it in the first place? And you think, what? And I see that cycle happening again and again, and, you know, so many reviews and ideas and things, and then the operationalization of them delivers like a teeny tiny bit, and you just end up with the status quo. We absolutely need to think, why are we not managing to break that? And if the answer is studying and understanding how they change, then people in charge need to do that much more.
Okay. I know there's lots of questions in the room. I think it's about time we went with people who had very recent experience of education.
Thank you. I was just going to ask about the distinction made between sort of social benefits of education and economic benefits of education. So I think there's certain cases where, for example, social benefits can actually result in financial benefits, as in people seeing the effects that university has, and it might not be of the same sense that sort of the private sector does in terms of like experiential value, but more deeper understanding that, okay, this is contributing to human development and human flourishing. And if that is the case, that the social benefit or like sort of social market gap, I suppose, can translate into economic benefits for universities, that only arises when people are actually exposed to the social benefits of universities, which as I said earlier, isn't always, with young people right now, it's very much like sort of marketing from private companies, social media, AI, those sorts of things are what people are being exposed to, and not very much of the sort of benefits that, for example, philosophers bring or anthropologists bring. And so my question would be, to what extent do you believe that there's an opportunity for higher education to sort of invest in a sort of model where you try and utilize or build up the social understanding of the benefits of universities through, for example, primary or secondary education, and utilize that to bring a form of financial funding towards universities?
I'm looking at James because I was going to suggest that you might want to talk about some of the work that University of West Scotland does with schools. I think it's an excellent question. One of the things that we need to think about when we're doing this is going back to the other question about systems. We are embarking on this as a disparate group of 19 institutions that make up a sector, and asking questions ourselves and trying to bring the government and the kind of decision makers along with us for that journey, so that it isn't just a quick fix structural change and short-termism in policy solutions. As a former civil servant, I'm more than aware of the attractiveness of that to ministers, but we're hoping that this is much more of a long-term discussion. But your point about the narrative, I guess, about the role of education is really important, and actually as technological advances become much more at the forefront of people's discussions, when we've been talking to people about this framework and about this opportunity, including employers, they have been talking about the need for philosophers in the accountancy firms, for example, that they're going to think about the ethics of the use of AI. So actually there's a much, I think that discussion's found its moment, and I think we need to capitalise on that through this process.
So I think the issue around how do we think about education as a whole system as opposed to primary, secondary, and then tertiary is really important. And individual pupils in secondary school understanding that university is not for them is as an important outcome as understanding university is for them. So what is for them? It might be an apprenticeship in a college, for example, or it might just be going straight into employment and then going into higher education, either through college or university, some way further down the line. As I mentioned earlier on, 45% of the students who come to UWS are there first in their family to go to university. They have no frame of reference as to what it is like to go to university. They don't have a mother or a father or a brother or a sister or even an aunt or an uncle to be able to tell them what it's like to go to university and who to go to in order to get that advice. So how do they get that social capital that you've been describing? And they will get that through their influencers. And if their influencers are at school, It's about getting them to understand what advice would you give to a young person who's thinking about going to college or thinking about going to university. But we tend to still think about the education system in these silos. And where we're trying to look at that horizontally as opposed to vertically, there are all sorts of interesting things that get in the way, including the funding model, including the perception, particularly in schools, around, well, this group will always go to this university, and it's this university that usually the teacher went to, not necessarily the university that the student might benefit most from, or indeed going to college as well. And from that, you will then end up with that social mobility, that economic mobility as well. And if you were to look around, this research is now out of date, but I suspect there'll be a similar sort of proportion, but similar sorts of places. It's about 10 years old now, but about 80% of the chief executives of FTSE 100 companies did not have business degrees. They didn't start out with business degrees. They started out with an arts and humanities degree. So when you think about that broadening of what does an education actually provide in that economic benefit, it's not necessarily because they started out thinking, I want to be the chief executive of a FTSE 100 company, but that's where they ended up. Oh.
I think Lindsay was mentioning quality of education. I think that's very important. Adam Smith seemed to agree with that notion. But I think in terms of different economies in different countries, for the quality of education in Smith's terms, would you say this means it's more pragmatic with the contents of its curriculum in emerging economies, for example, focusing on education in regards to an increasing growth in provision of services like business studies and accounting, and then with more developed countries being able to make space for the finer subjects like art and drama and things, and then maybe developing economies focusing on education that relates to the manufacture of material goods, which they generally develop in surplus. Basically, my question is the aim of quality education to create a workforce that's cohesive with the economy, or might Smith say that it is something else? And then, if Lindsay's able to answer that, to the other members of the panel, I'd ask, to what extent would you agree with Smith's view on the quality, or what creates quality in education, basically? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question. Actually, the answer is basically that it would, given that anybody leaving school at age, say, 16 to 18 now, will be in the workforce for, it has to be said, probably now about half a century. The key thing to prepare in any economy now is for flexibility. So let me go back to that research that I mentioned a minute ago about the economics of education and how there was a lot of debate until about 10, 15 years ago about whether there was any causal connection. Now, the one thing that the previous research was unambiguous about was that when you move a society from 90% illiteracy and innumeracy to 90% numeracy and literacy, then that has an enormous economic benefit. Now, when you think about it, that's consistent with the research more recently that I summarised, which is about the quality of education, because clearly moving somebody from being illiterate to being literate is an enormous improvement in the quality of what they can learn as well as what they've actually learned. And of course, most of that research, the data was being driven by the transition mainly in Africa, but in other parts of the world that had formerly been colonised by European powers. So that's one thing to say, that there are places where you move from illiteracy to numeracy, and that makes an enormous difference. But that is a very much smaller part of the world economy. It's still there. There are still parts of sub-Saharan Africa and a few other places where that is still a major challenge. But it's by no means the same level of challenge as it was in the middle of the 20th century in the immediate aftermath of immediate decolonising period. And of course, many of the former colonies are now far better than we are. Singapore, Korea, noticeable examples. So the question then is, what would we need now? Now, a second body of research is also very important here. We know from research that specifically vocational education is very good at getting people who would otherwise be unemployed into the labour market. That's, again, a finding that's been found over and over again. So targeting what the English government the government in England is currently doing, trying to target vocational qualifications at people who are at risk of dropping out of positive engagement altogether is a good move, but it's a very limited move, because it turns out, in fact, that if you look at longitudinal studies that look at people not 5 years after they left school or left full-time education, but say 20, 30 years, it turns out that having done a general education, and that includes things like philosophy, for example, having a generally educated mind like that, and that, of course, can come from the sciences and technology just as much can come from the humanities and social sciences. Having a generally educated mind creates the flexibility of thinking that enables you to respond to changing economic circumstances. So that's my main reply to your question. I wouldn't want to segment the kind of education that people have on the basis of the current division of labour in the international economic structures, because that division of labour will undoubtedly change during these people's lifetimes. And so what we need to have, what all of these countries need to do, is create a flexible workforce that will respond and take advantages of new opportunities as they arise economically.
So just to answer your question, I agree entirely with what Lindsay was saying. The difficulty is that politicians wouldn't necessarily agree with what he's saying, and they're the ones that are creating the kind of environment, particularly in higher education, where you do get the language that Claire talked about earlier around Mickey Mouse degrees, and we should, there are certain degrees that we should not have. And you may have seen an interview quite recently with Laura Kuenssberg, an opposition spokesperson, when she asked them very specifically, okay, if you want to get rid of some of these degrees, which ones are you going to get rid of? And what did they want to get rid of? Arts and humanities degrees, which are the very ones that you've just said are the ones that we should be developing more in developing countries. So unfortunately, politicians wouldn't agree with Lindsay, and they ought to.
A lot of talk about Adam Smith, what he would have done. In his day, there was two things that were not the sort of thing you would talk about here. One was Scotland, it's only mentioned twice. The other was democracy. He didn't have democracy, it didn't exist then. I wonder how Adam Smith would have seen the role of democracy, the role of education in producing a mature democracy. We have to look around the world just now and look at some very challenged democracies where education is becoming less important. I wonder what Adam Smith would have thought about that.
Specifically in Adam Smith, but not, of course, on answer to the more general question. Adam Smith, yes, he was on the threshold of democracy. And he does talk, I quoted a bit there when he talked about the importance of general education to reduce what he called enthusiasm and superstition. Enthusiasm, of course, was a negative word in the 18th century. It meant fanaticism. And he said that good education would diminish that. And he said that was particularly important in societies where the very existence of social order depended on the consent of the people. Now, he didn't mean that, of course, in a post-19th century liberal democratic way. But what he's talking about is the kind of language that was finding itself into what had just been the French Revolution and had just been the American Revolution, that language of the consent of the people. And the interpretation of that has changed over the time, but I think it's reasonable to say that that was a proto-democratic view. And anyway, the key thing was that even in a country like Britain, with at that time extremely limited franchise, he nevertheless felt that the government depended on the consent of the people, and the consent of the people would be more likely to occur if they were well educated.
As well, I was trying to draw a line between Smith and Carnegie, but I think that's exactly where Carnegie would have come from. The whole point of libraries and the investment in universities was absolutely about people being able to educate themselves, and this idea that if people were educated, then they would be more kind of democratic citizens. So I think that follows.
I was just going to add, I think there's increasing, in the world that we currently live in, where being able to distinguish fact from opinion and to be able to critically assess the material that particularly young people are facing daily on their phones, the idea that the more educated you are, the less likely you are to be susceptible to extremism, and that's obviously a bit of a generalisation, but in general, in the world that we're living in, and if we want to protect our democratic institutions, which were designed on the basis that everyone would be a good faith actor, and we only have to look to the United States to see how how vulnerable those democratic systems are, the importance of education obviously couldn't be overstated in that context.
Can I say something else as well? Because I think there's a link there as well, though, to that kind of people's perceptions of kind of institutions and kind of government and universities included in that. And I think that kind of this idea that people are are wary already, and actually there's something about how that story's told to grab them back, because there is a real worry that actually it's already tipped the balance in the sense that people are kind of rejecting those kind of democratic institutions because they don't actually see them as being that democratic. And when your choice then becomes, feels like then that can be co-opted very easily by people who don't necessarily want a democracy. And then you end up with a choice between something which is, feels really unpalatable and the status quo, which also, as we've talked about in terms of system change and things, also isn't really working. And it feels like we're really missing something which is more positive in terms of change and more kind of systemic reform rather than just maintaining what we have and calling it democratic.
I can probably just squeeze one other question. I'm just going to go to the people who've been waving most enthusiastically.
I apologise that I don't think this is specifically higher education related, but it does cover a lot of the themes that have been talked about. And in particular, possibly just a reiteration of what has just been talked about. I've got to be in my bonnet about financial literacy. Now, I don't know the state of financial literacy in schools or otherwise. I don't know what's currently taught. It feels like there's always the potential for more of it to be taught. And it gives benefits in various ways, such as has just been highlighted. And a couple of those ways, one of which is obviously an educated populace. Many elections are won on the back of at least discussions about the economy, if not the details of the economy. An educated populace would then be able to discern rhetoric from reality or what the implications of certain manifesto promises would be further down the line. And then the second thing is just on a purely domestic front. You talked about the high number of people attending who are trying to balance jobs and families at the same time. Being able to balance the books of those families in a competent way would potentially give them an easier time. Does the panel think that there are any downsides to high financial literacy population-wide? Am I being naive? Are there certain forces, either be they political or otherwise, that would rather that actually financial literacy was kept as low as it possibly is at the minute?
I personally don't think there are any particular downsides to it and to better financial literacy. And I don't know what's taught in schools now. Lindsay might have more of an idea. I was part of a conversation quite recently, however, with someone who was talking about with a school teacher, and their impression was there was almost none within schools, and that was causing some of the difficulties that you've described. And I was comparing it when I was at school, and I remember being in, I think it was probably early years of secondary school, where the local bank manager came along and talked to us about the importance of saving, how to write a cheque, how not to write a cheque, and when not to write a cheque. So the fact that I actually remembered that probably means that it was a worthwhile session to hold. And the fact that we don't have that any longer is probably a real shame.
You may remember that one of the things I quoted from Smith when he was talking about the way in which the division of labour creates torpor of mind. And one of the things he said one of the harmful effects was that it would render people incapable of judgment concerning many even of the ordinary duties of private life, which is exactly summed up there. So it seems almost impossible to argue against the wisdom of what you've said, and I won't try to do so, but I would add this, that the skills required in family budgeting or budgeting of any kind, or understanding what the Chancellor is doing or whatever, are the skills of mathematical thinking, ultimately. And you create a far more flexible capacity deal either with the private circumstances or the public duties that Smith also talked about. If we educated people well in mathematical thinking, and at the same time also as part of that mathematics, teach them how to think about applying that mathematics to a variety of new circumstances. So although I too remember a bank manager, I have absolutely no recollection whatsoever of what the bank manager said, because it wasn't actually very good as a teacher. What I do remember, however, is maths teachers, who I think instilled in me the capacity to understand later on how to balance books, how to understand the exchequer, and so on and so forth. So it's general knowledge, not too specific knowledge.
I know there's still many questions in the room, so I can only apologise that I've not managed to come round and get them all. But we are out of time. So can we thank the panellists for the fantastic conversation today?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Graham, as well, for chairing this evening. I just want to say a few things before we go. I realise that in my introduction, I never explained why it's a library of mistakes. Well, this library specialises in the history of finance. What's the best way to learn about finance? One mistake at a time. And if you look at the books that you all passed as you came in, these are all about financial crises. The books on this side is economic theory. I naturally gravitate over to this side of the library. Now, in fact, I think I'm going to disagree slightly with Lindsay Patterson, in the sense that I'm aware that the ground underneath me suddenly seems very shaky. But I am thinking that when Smith writes about human capital, or talks about education, you suggested that perhaps he is thinking in terms of human capital. Perhaps he has glimpses of that. But it is certainly not well thought out. And particularly, Adam Smith considered that professors were amongst the unproductive workers in society. But this is because he had a very particular definition of productive labour, that productive labour should provide the revenues which would allow the restoration of the capital stock which was used up. If we take a long-term view of education, then of course, in many ways, the professors, because they're creating knowledge, and I would say that in Smith thought of capital as being the wealth of nations. But instead of perhaps thinking of the fixed capital in terms of goods, perhaps we should be capital goods. Perhaps we should be thinking instead in terms of the knowledge across society. And so that's part of what we're trying to do with this. Other things which occur to me. I was asked by several people when they heard I was organising Smith in Education, is this going to be contribute to the election campaign? And I'm aware that some people suggested in the panel perhaps this isn't going to be a pleasant experience. My answer was yes, it's going to be extremely important, but only in 2031. And finally, I suppose, this, we hope, is only going to be the start of quite a long series of discussions. Around the library, on just about every flat surface, you will see forms like this. What we would like to do for our next time is, rather than having one concept and then talking about it in general terms, give people much more precise questions to focus on. And so this is your opportunity to submit questions. We've already got about half a dozen, but the more we have, the more choice we'll have. And this is very much following in the tradition of the Enlightenment supper clubs. There are a few final things which I have to say. There are some books on at the back. There's merchandise at the back. You have to buy the merchandise. You can donate for the books. In fact, you can donate to the library. You can join the library as a member. We're delighted to have more members. I'm also aware that our drinks are sponsored by Kennox Asset Management. I think I'm expected to mention that. And then the very final thing that you can do to help us before you leave, if you have drinks, could you take your glasses to the table at the back? And I think, Lauren, I should thank you as well for all your help during the week. Lewis, who has been doing a sterling job in keeping the panellists, making sure they get here fully briefed about what's going on. Thank you very much for that. And to you as the audience as well, thank you for coming along on a Friday evening when there are so many other things to do in Edinburgh. Thank you, and goodbye.